A very warm good evening to all of you. Hello and welcome to the Fireside Chat on Green Recovery. Before we get into the session, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's session are being recorded and you'll be able to view them on our YouTube channel under the name of Access Development Services. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it further. We also invite you to comment and questions. Please take a look at the Q&A chat box in your screen. And if you think a question for any speaker at any point, you can type it in there and we will hold it for the discussion portion at the end of the session. Now moving forward, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Ashish Kothari, founder member of Kalpvriksh and member of many movements. Mr. Kothari has taught at Indian Institute of Public Administration and has coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Welcome, sir. And now I would like to invite Mr. Sabha Kalam from Climate Change and Energy Division at UNDP India to start the fireside chat. Over to you, Sabha. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's pleasure to have Ashish in this fireside chat. You've already introduced him, although he has much more in terms of what he has done in past 30 years. He's a prominent environmentalist and he has written a number of books on biodiversity and several other things. Ashish, to start with, I think one of the favorite topic that you have, because you have written a lot about it, on EcoSwaraj. So can you tell us a little bit more about what EcoSwaraj is all about and how it tries to amalgamate Swaraj with the ecological crisis, to handle ecological crisis in a better way?
Sure, Sabha. So, well, if we go back to the sort of ancient Indian notion of Swaraj, which of course Gandhi made popular during the independence struggle, basically what it's talking about is autonomy, freedom, self-determination for an individual or a community or a country, but in a way that it also ensures everybody else's well-being and autonomy and freedom and self-determination. So it cannot be a notion where I will do what I want, regardless of its impacts on other people, right? Which means that it is also a process by which one is looking within oneself, where as an individual, but also as a community, and expressing and living responsibly for other people, but also for the planet and for other species. And that's why we added the word eco in front. Now, another way of putting this, maybe in English, is what we call radical ecological democracy, where, and I'll explain that a bit later as we get into the conversation, that radical democracy is really about all of us being part of decision-making, being responsible to the planet, to the earth, to the ecological sustainability issues that are so very prominent today. And why we promote concept like this, and there are similar concepts in different parts of the world, is as a challenge to the current notions of development, which are based on extracting more and more and more resources from the earth and putting back or dumping back waste. As we see, the whole planet has been converted into a planet of waste, and it has also been converted into, thousands and thousands and thousands of square kilometers of open pit mining, and the destruction of the land and the destruction of the oceans and the water and so on. All of that with very grave consequences also for communities, especially those who are most dependent on natural ecosystems and on nature. But actually all of us, if you happen to be living in Delhi, whether you're rich or poor, you're also going to be impacted by the air pollution if you just step out of your house. So it's that sort of destructive and unequal notion of development and economic growth, as against which we are positing notions like and practices of EcoSwaraj as alternatives.
Okay, no, good. It's continuing, and the crisis that we talked about and the solution in terms of the EcoSwaraj, of course, the crisis is continuing and continuing from past so many decades, especially post-industrialization, and where the economic growth has taken over everything, and where urban spaces is taking over the rural and rural spaces as well as the forest area. So do you really think, we are going to stop somewhere? Do you think, there is enough in terms of the alarm that has been raised that's going to stop this or at least slow down the pace?
I think it's going to slow down for two reasons. One is people's resistance and the kind of mobilization that's happening all over the world, especially by young people, whether it's on climate or it's on pollution or it's on inequality or social justice. So many different aspects people are, young people especially, are bringing up people's movements. But the second reason it's also going to slow down is because we simply don't have that climate and ecological space anymore. I mean, how much more can one keep expanding and expanding and expanding? So there are going to be limits that the economy will face because of its being placed within an ecological sense. But unfortunately, Sabah, this slowing down is going to be too slow. Unless we do something much more, it's going to be too slow for the planet and for us. We already know that with the climate crisis, for instance, which is right now being talked about, or the biodiversity crisis, which has been around with us for much longer, that we are living beyond what the earth can sustain us, well beyond what the earth can sustain us. And we're seeing that the impacts of that with incredible amounts of wildfire, of droughts, of floods, of cyclones, of tornadoes, of so many different things where, in a sense, kind of nature is hitting back at the kind of misuse that we have done. And in India also, we see actually the same thing, because India is one of those countries which keep saying we have to grow at 6%, 7%, 10%. I mean, virtually all countries do that. But in India, it's the same narrative. And already back in, I think it was 2008, a report by the, interestingly, the Confederation of Indian Industries, along with a group called the Global Footprints Network. That report showed that we were already living in India. We were already living at 1.5 to 2 times our biological capacity, ecological capacity, which means we were actually significantly overusing our water and our forests and our land, etc. And you can't create these in a lab, right? I mean, they are things that are given to us by nature. A World Bank report showed also many years back that the ecological damage, some parameters of ecological damage, were actually reducing our economic growth by 5.7%. And at that time, I think we were growing at about 6%, which means effectively we were at zero, right? Probably negative because they didn't take into account many. So if you take these sorts of things into account and you really build ecological sustainability into, or ecological impact into the economic paradigms, you'll find that the current model is just completely unsustainable, globally as well as for India. And it is unequal. We now live in the most unequal era ever of human history, right? And in India, the latest report shows 1% of Indians, India's rich, are owning more than 50% of its wealth.
Yeah.
And it's only increasing, this inequality.
No, that's
so clearly there's something fundamentally wrong with this model. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I mean, the pace that is required it's lower there. I mean, of course, everybody is saying that we are trying to do, but the pace that is required, I mean, we are still lagging behind significantly. But Ashish, I just wanted to know through the pandemic's perspective as well, because the pandemic, I mean, this particular pandemic, I would say, has really, I mean, opened eyes of many people, especially people who are more pro-economic growth and less on the environment conservation. And we have seen that how pollution had slowed down, I mean, during the first wave of COVID. So now, I mean, the economies are going to recover globally. Of course, in India as well, the economy is recovering now. Factories are now starting. All this is happening. Do you think this is the right time as well to put the environmental concerns forward and to really mainstream the concerns that we have on the environment? Because, I mean, not many policies will be designed. I mean, we have seen that there are economic policies which have been designed during the first wave of COVID. Some gaps, some measures were devised where they were giving packages to MSMEs and all. So, do you think, I mean, either we have missed the boat completely, or you think, I mean, we still have some scope of using this as an opportunity to really look at the environment more closely?
I think the opportunity is certainly very ripe. We have realized that. We know that COVID itself and many of the other such similar crises we've faced in the past are at least partly a result of ecological imbalance that we have caused. And so going back to the pre-COVID times, which is unfortunately what most governments seem to be wanting to do, should not be an option, because all we're doing is postponing the collapse by maybe another couple of years or something. There'll be yet another crisis, whether it's a virus or it's a climate caused collapse or something else, or a financial collapse, right? Mm-hmm. So clearly, this is a good opportunity for us to fundamentally reassess the directions the economy is to take, and of course society. So I'm going to give you maybe 2 or 3 examples of what we have been documenting in terms of community resilience during COVID times, because what those examples point towards is what should the policies be for a recovery that truly respects people and nature. So one example is from 5,000 Dalit women farmers in Telangana, who are part of an organization called Deccan Development Society. And they, during both the first and the second phases of the pandemic, were totally self-sufficient with food, because 25 years back, they had actually switched back to their traditional low input, local seed-based, rain-fed dryland agriculture, totally organic. And achieved what they call food sovereignty, or EcoSwaraj, right? So complete control over everything to do with food, not just food security. And they were not just food secure during COVID, they were actually giving some of their food grains to the district relief measures in that. Another example I can give you is from central India, where many communities have been able to reclaim their collective rights to the forest using the Forest Rights Act. And because of that, for the last several years, they've been harvesting parts of the forest sustainably. And some of the revenues from that actually go into a village fund. Now, when the first wave of the pandemic hit, and a lot of the workers who had gone out actually had to come back to the village and had nothing, they didn't really have anything to fall back on. It's these village funds that were used to tide them over those few months of the economic lockdown. And there are many, many, many others. So we've collected about 65 such stories already. There are many more that we're collecting. I'll put the link in the chat box for people to look at. Now, what does this show us? It shows us that any kind of recovery needs to have 3 or 4 very crucial points to it. One, and I call that a rainbow recovery, and I'll get back into that and why I call it that. One, that we have to focus a lot of efforts, incentives, investments, etc. You mentioned MSMEs, into agriculture and land-based occupations, into crafts and other small manufacturing kind of opportunities, into the regeneration of land and water. The 60-70% of our land and water areas are actually badly degraded. Now, if you put all of this, and also a lot of this in urban areas is very much possible. If you put all of this together, you could probably generate 200 or 300 million jobs in the next few years, easily, probably more, right? But what does this mean? It means that you have to move all the focus that you have right now on big industry, on mechanized forms of production, on big corporations. That has to shift to worker cooperatives, local producer companies, to the entire 60-70% of the population that actually is dependent still on these forms of livelihoods, which unfortunately are being increasingly pushed into becoming labor in construction areas or labor in factories or whatever it is. And then when there's a collapse, they actually all trudge back home. So the recovery package, I mean, the so-called Atmanirbhar Bharat packages, that 3 of them that have been announced since the first wave of the pandemic, they have some elements of this, but by and large, they miss the boat. By and large, I mean, for instance, 60 new coal blocks have been auctioned in the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Makes no sense, because they're in the middle of the most biologically diverse and Adivasi dependent, Adivasis are dependent on those forests. You're actually displacing communities that are relatively Atmanirbhar, self-reliant, and throwing them out in the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat. So we have a lot of reorientation I think that needs to be done if we're really serious about this. Crafts is another big area. We have probably had something like 100 to 200 million people who had crafts as their occupations, handicrafts and other sorts of crafts as their occupations. Most of them, or many of them, have been destroyed or are being destroyed because you've gone into large-scale mechanized production. Just to give you a simple example of this, a village called Kunaria, which did extremely well in protecting both health and livelihoods, economic livelihoods of its residents in Kutch, both in the first and the second wave. We've got a case study on this already. There, the Sarpanch, Suresh Changa, told me this. He said, we did a survey during the pandemic because it was very difficult for them to access the market. We did a survey of how much we are spending on daily household items. And in that village of 3,000 people, they were spending 45 lakh rupees a month just on household items, right? Soap, incense, utensils, footwear, etc. And he said, why can't we, with maybe a cluster of 20 villages, produce all of this here? Why do we need multinational corporations to produce our soap? Makes no sense. We can do it here, and we can exchange it locally with other villages that produce something else. So that is the way to go if we're really serious about a recovery that is both people and environment friendly.
I think, that's really an interesting concept, not only concept, but something that everybody can also practice. Of course, as we say, the desires are unlimited, the needs are limited. So if we are going to only target needs, and probably this concept is the most feasible to adopt. Ashish, you touched upon the rainbow recovery. It will be really good to know about, how the rainbow recovery can help to tackle such situations. Not only such situations, but going forward as well. How rainbow recovery can be adopted as an option for not only recovering from shocks, but also for the progressive growth that we look at.
So I think the reason I've called it rainbow recovery is because in many parts of the world, people are talking about green recoveries or ecologically sensitive recovery, or different kind of terms are being used. And of course, in many ways, they're progressive trends. But for me, the combination of ecological sustainability with social justice in all of its forms, gender, against casteism, rights for people with disabilities, etc., all of this. It's this combination which is really crucial. Because if we don't have it, what we will do is we might end up protecting a forest, but through a national park, which displaces the local Adivasis. Yeah, or we might end up creating wealth for a dispossessed community or poor community, but by cutting down the forest there and selling it off as timber. So if we think of only one dimension of life, and unfortunately that's what development does, and that's how governments behave, because they're all partitioned into these silos with each department and ministry. If we do it like that, we will create these sorts of problems. We have to think holistically. We have to think as a system and say, okay, how does these transformations take place? So the same Dalit women farmers example that I gave you, it wasn't just food security and sovereignty and transformation of agriculture. For them, it was also a means of fighting against patriarchy. It was also a means of fighting against casteism as Dalit women, right? They then also went ahead and created their own community media, community radio and filmmaking unit. There's no reason why filmmaking should happen only in Bollywood, right? So if you can think of actually decentralizing this kind of all forms of production and services all across all the settlements of the country, and along with that also struggles for social justice, gender, caste, etc., and the regeneration of our land and water and our forests and spaces for wildlife, it becomes revolutions of multiple colors, recoveries of multiple colors. And of course, also sexuality and LGBTQ and all of that comes in. So that's why I've used the term rainbow recovery or rainbow deals, New Deal, for what we're actually talking about. And none of this is unfeasible. You mentioned needs. It's actually beyond needs. It's also aspirations. See, what do people aspire for, and why do they aspire for it? We have to get into that, right? If I'm aspiring for good communications, if I'm aspiring for entertainment, if I'm aspiring for my children to go to a good educational institution, if I'm aspiring to have good health, right? One can think of a lot of these as both needs and aspirations, but they can all be met through these sorts of sensitive, ecologically sensitive and decentralized distributed ways. Yes, if I'm aspiring for more and more and more and more consumption, I want the latest iPhone and I want the latest, the biggest television set, etc., etc. Sorry, that's not sustainable. So we have to generate a discussion in society as to also what is sustainable consumption and what is the impact of unsustainable consumption on somebody else's life who may not even be able to get the basic food. Forget about 40-inch color television set. They may not even get basic food because we have stolen their resources for our consumption patterns. So we're going to have to ask those questions also.
No, that's very true. That's very true. You related it very well. I mean, going beyond the needs as well, it's aspiration, not only desires. But Ashish, I mean, coming back on the recovery, this rainbow recovery again, of course, community and government is also going to be major player. And the gap that we see right now between the communities and the government is too huge. I mean, of course, the civil society organizations are playing a major role in voicing the concerns of the communities to the government. But majorly, I mean, of course, and we are also seeing, I mean, the constraints they are facing with fundings and different kind of things right now. But going forward, how do you think, I mean, this gap can be bridged? Either bridged or at least, I mean, government can shift more towards communities listening to communities.
Yeah, so Sabha, if you look at it, we brought in the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments a long time back, right? More than 2 decades ago. Was it almost 3 decades now? So they were brought in with the idea, the spirit of it was that there would be local self-governance, both in villages and in cities. Unfortunately, it's only where people have really struggled, or occasionally where there's been a good official in charge, or a good politician or whatever it is, maybe a couple of state governments that have done more than the others. But unfortunately, in most parts of India, that has been left on paper. I mean, the spirit is there, but it's actually not implemented on the ground. And one of the reasons is that the laws that came in as a result of those constitutional amendments did not decentralize financial and legal powers. So most of the money is still controlled by the government, and so is the law, right? State governments or central government. And what we need is, Nagaland, for instance, moved a little further ahead on that. It said that it has a Village Council Act, in which village councils are actually empowered to even create their own laws for conservation or for other sorts of things. Now, that is the kind of thing that we actually ideally would have needed. So if we are serious about community voices being very centrally part of decision making, we have to go much further towards what I call radical democracy, or initially said Swaraj. That was Gandhi's notion, right? When he says Swaraj, it was about people being able to control their own destinies. It was not about politicians controlling our destinies or bureaucrats controlling our destinies, which raises the question, what is democracy? See, the original meaning of the word democracy is power of the people. Democracy. It's not power of those we elect. Unfortunately, most countries of the world think of democracy as only elections. So that's ridiculous. So today we elect a party and we say, oh gosh, it's not doing the right thing. We'll try and elect the next party and then a third party and then come back to the first party. Whereas in fact, what we should be saying is what the 90 villages in Kochi in Gadchiroli district of Maharashtra, starting with one village which has become quite famous, Mendhalekha, said. They said, yeah, we elect the government in Mumbai and in New Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. All decisions will be taken by or through us and not by any bureaucrats, and that they will be taken by consensus where the entire village is involved. The women are involved, the children are involved, not just the men and not just a mukhya or a sarpanch, right? You have, and of course, that's a process. You have to create the capacity, the empowerment, the confidence, the self-confidence for people to do that. But this is something that is happening in some parts of India, and much more can happen if we are really truly serious about people's voices coming in to decision making.
Yeah. No, you are right. I mean, the way we have interpreted democracy is completely different. and we are actually following something which is working against us rather than for us. No, you're right. One specific question, Ashish, because I mean, livelihood is connected very closely with the changing climate. And right now, I mean, we see that globally, even in the last COP as well, countries have announced their enhanced nationally determined contributions. Now, if I see personally, I mean, Paris Agreement is a mitigation goal. Yeah, I mean, we talk about limiting temperature rise by 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. That's about reducing emissions. But for country like India, especially for developing countries, and for country like India, where we have so much of diversity in terms of ecology, in terms of say regions we have, uh, adaptation is something which is very very important. Yeah, and adaptation more so because I mean there are so many livelihoods dependent on nature-based products or say forest produce or coastal areas. Yeah, so especially in terms of livelihood, I mean, what do you see should be the adaptation goal for India going forward? That will help, I mean, communities to really recover rather than only trying to mitigate climate change to whatever temperature goal we have set.
Yeah, and I think actually, I mean, you're right. So, and I actually think that with adaptation, we're really, really, really far behind. We haven't really thought this through at all in our climate action plans. So, I think one of the most important things for adaptation is diversification of the economy for local people, and the second very important thing is the regeneration and protection of the natural environment. So, if you take the first one. When you have a green revolution kind of a model in which a single crop is grown over a very large area, and something happens, climate disaster takes place, or a new pest comes in, or the rain just doesn't fall, or whatever, and more of this is going to happen, right? Then there's total collapse of that particular agricultural, that region and its agriculture. But if you had a diversity of crops growing, which is traditionally what people were doing, right? There were villages in which 10, 15, 20 different varieties of rice would grow, or you'd have multi-cropping systems in which there's 10 different crops, or like, for instance, all across the Himalaya, they had something called the Baranaja system, 11, 12, 13 different crops growing together. So if you had a climate event or something like that, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 crops would collapse, but the others would still be there. You'd have things to fall back on, right? At the same time, if they were regenerating and protecting their forest or their coastal areas or their grasslands or their wetlands, whatever their natural ecosystems are, they would have that also to fall back on. And many of these natural ecosystems would also be natural barriers against, we saw during the tsunami, right, that where the mangroves were still existing, there was less impact on the communities living inland than where the coastal areas had been completely exposed by destruction of mangroves or beaches. So, or coral reefs. So this combination is actually absolutely important. I've been going to Ladakh very often. I was there for a month just in September, and people are already facing very serious consequences of climate thing. Glaciers receding, less water, the winter is much less cold, and so it affects the entire production patterns, both in agriculture and in pastoralism, which are the most important livelihood sources there. And adaptation would then have to get into looking at how would one continue or create diversity in livelihood, in livestock and agriculture, and also create opportunities for non-agriculture based economic livelihoods in each of those villages and settlements, in order for them to be able to cope with that. How do you create new forms of localized water harvesting and water management, so that even with less water they can actually do things? So there's multiple different things on multiple arenas that have to be done for adaptation, and involving the communities, using and help and building on their own knowledge is a very crucial part of this also. They're not just outside experts coming in and saying, this is what we have to do, that's what we have to do. But okay, what is the local knowledge already on water? What's the local knowledge on agriculture? What's the local knowledge of, Dr. Ganesh Devi, a linguist, he conducted this People's Linguistic Survey of India a few years back. Amazing. Yeah. He said, in Himachal Pradesh, there are 230 different words for snow. Okay. each of those words hides knowledge about snowfall, about melt, about winter, all kinds of things. Incredible knowledge that's important for dealing with climate change. Now, when in the schools in Himachal Pradesh, we teach only in Hindi and all the other local languages get wiped out, we're actually wiping out that enormous knowledge. So it also means that fundamental changes in our education system, if we want to really be able to adapt to and also mitigate the kinds of impacts we're seeing.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Why I'm asking this question, because I really like the concept of EcoSwaraj and how it can help to build adaptive capacities of the communities as well. Because right now, I mean, India is of course, India, like other countries, is also dependent on external financing, climate financing, more precisely. Going forward, I mean, such concepts will help domestically to adapt in a better way rather than, I mean, waiting for financing to come or waiting for external aid to come and then we adapt, because the climate change is going to hit. And of course, I mean, we have to see how we can save ourselves rather than, I mean, look for more financing and get financing and then save ourselves. So, I mean, we have our own goals in terms of the NDCs, which India has announced. There we have one goal on adaptation as well, which is more looking at livelihood and things like that. So EcoSwaraj is something which I think is something which fits very well, which might help the government to also think about how innovatively we can look at enhancing adaptive capacity domestically rather than looking for, as you said, I mean, looking for experts telling us. So on EcoSwaraj, of course, I mean, right now, I think the concept that you have talked about, I mean, as per my understanding, it's still localized. It's still not pan-India. So going forward, I mean, if you really want to take it pan-India, if you really want to scale this up, what are the hurdles you think are there, which on priority you would like to really address, which will give a lot of impetus to enhance the scale of this EcoSwaraj concept significantly?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there are, of course, many hurdles, but one of them is the way our macroeconomy itself is structured and who takes decisions with regard to the sort of bigger economic policies and programs, right? I mean, these are decisions taken in New Delhi with very little consultation of the kind of communities that I'm talking about. So to give you a simple example of the kind of change or shifts that would be needed and that would help tremendously, and where we don't need money from outside, we have 80,000 crore rupees or 90,000 crore rupees going into chemical fertilizer subsidy, right? Now, if we were to say that over the next 5 years, we will shift that into organic, not only zero budget, which now suddenly has become popular and even the PM is talking about it. I mean, at least they're thinking about it, which is good. But like diverse forms of sustainable, local, small, farmer-based ecological agriculture, you would see millions more farmers shifting away from chemicals into organic. And that is extremely good for the climate also, because fertilizers, etc., are a major source of greenhouse gases. So that's just one example. One can think of many more. So for instance, instead of putting so much attention into, let's say, electric cars, moving away from fossil fuel based cars to electric cars, which is not bad. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but put a lot more attention into public transportation and into creating cycle lanes and walkways all across our cities. This is not expensive. These are not expensive. I mean, compared to what we're doing otherwise, it's not so expensive. We'd create more jobs and we would create much healthier cities, and we would reduce significantly also the climate emissions. So there are many such things where, in fact, financing, innovative ways of thinking about funds and financing, and providing much more of the confidence on local solutions, local communities, would then actually manage to scale this across a much larger area. You can, if 10 million more farmers switch to organic because you're shifting the subsidies into that, that's scale, right? If you're providing much more incentives for, say, cycling and walking, by just simply creating cycle lanes and proper walkways, that's a huge incentive for many more people to actually do that rather than taking their motorized vehicles out. And so one can think of that for every, in the construction sector. In the construction sector, which is one of our biggest sources of ecological damage, actually incentivizing the use of local materials. It could be wood, it could be mud, it could be all kinds of things. And even in cities now, people are making 2, 3, 4-story buildings with those sorts of local materials, bamboo, for instance. You would actually incentivize much cheaper and much more localized and much more ecologically friendly construction patterns. None of this, of course, is going to happen if you're putting all your eggs into the baskets of big corporations, including renewable energy. I mean, if the Adanis and the Reliances are the ones who are going to get all the incentives for creating solar, then that doesn't solve the problem that I'm talking about. But if you were to give those incentives to local communities, to rooftop solar, to every school and college to create its own decentralized local energy source, and to be able to actually sell back into the grid and in fact make money also in the process, you would, the scale would be significantly higher than what is currently happening. So to my mind, those are the solutions to scale. They're about policy shifts of this kind.
No, I mean,
and many more stories. So for instance, the kind of examples I've given you, we have, I think, 1,800 stories of positive transformation on our website, vikalpsangam.org. Now, so those stories exist, but let's look at them, let's listen to them, let's hear them, lessons are, and then how do we also enable exchanges between communities where somebody has successfully done something like this, another community is struggling, enable an exchange where they learn from each other. You don't necessarily always have to have, government department officers or professors or people like you and me to go into the villages to do that. Community to community exchange would be an enormously effective way of also doing this.
Yeah. No, I mean, listening to you makes me realize that probably when we have the wrong priorities as well, I mean, we look for more high-rise rather than mud houses. We look for glamour than sustainability, those kind of stuff. Yeah. So of course, I mean, we have chosen the wrong priority, and probably we going forward, we are going to choose more such priorities. But there is a large section of society who also realizes that the way we are going is not going to sustain us for long. Yeah. And the good part is that this section of society is now increasing. The numbers are increasing. And there I'm really hopeful that, I mean, say 10 years, 20 years, we might just realize that we need to really change drastically. Yeah. So I would like to know I mean, because we are also a development agency, you are also a development institution. So we have a critical responsibility, of course, in many ways, not only in terms of only demonstrating successful models, but also in bringing people together. So in the current scenario right now, among the development agencies, civil society organizations, bilateral agencies, what do you think is something which can really accelerate this process of bringing more people together, thinking about sustainability rather than just economic growth?
Well, I think we need much more dialogue amongst ourselves also, because civil society also goes in many different directions. And partner agencies, donor agencies also go in many different directions. I think the more we can dialogue, the more we can actually share stories, the more we can actually, as I said, enable exchanges. And the more we're convinced that there are alternative directions that we can take, whether it's UNDP or any of the other agencies, or whether it's Kalpavriksha or any of the other NGOs, are able to actually provide inputs much more to them, whether it's funding or it's technical expertise, or it's, as I said, enabling exchanges, many other things, legal advice, etc. Not to teach them what to do, but just provide things that they themselves may not have, and then enable them to build on their own agency and their own knowledge. To me, that would be the most important thing. When we started putting these positive stories together, Sabha, I was actually very surprised over the last 42 years of working that there is so much of a focus on the negative, whether it's the media or it's NGOs, etc., or on supporting the mainstream models of development, and very little focus research, media, very little focus on these wonderful, genuine alternatives that people are coming up with. And so we just need much more of that, to my mind. And we need to also then say, okay, what are the frameworks of holistic transformation that are emerging from this? So that, like I said right at the beginning, instead of focusing on one sector only, which might cause a problem in another sector, how do we look at this through a much more holistic way? I'm just going to put for a second something that we've developed through the Vikalp process, which we call the flower of transformation. And here what we're trying to do is to see how do transformations, or what kind of transformations are taking place and should take place in 5 spheres of life: the political, the economic, the cultural, the social, and the ecological. And what are their intersections? How is change in one impacting the other? Okay. And at the core of that, what are the ethics? What are the principles? Do we have the principles of solidarity, the principles of equality, the principles of ecological sustainability, of diversity, etc.? Do we have those at the core of whatever we're doing? And to my mind, it's actually being able to use these kinds of systematic, holistic framework in all of our work that would probably enable us to support and enable, as you question, enable scale much better.
Yeah, probably my last or second last question. We are very close to the closure time. Of course, you have seen decades of evolution, especially in terms of how Indian society has completely changed, looking at communities, livelihood, all of that. You have seen, I mean, past 30, 40 decades. Yeah. So you have much more experience than I think some of us. So in next 10 years, how do you think is going to be how the economic development is going to be measured? Is it that we are going to move focus on the HDI, Human Development Index, or happiness index, or something like that? Or we are still going to look at the GDP or the 5 trillion, 10 trillion economy?
Well, I'm not I can't predict the future, but I think 10 years is probably too short a time span for a very significant fundamental change. For now, both in civil society and some parts of government, there is at least a talk about going beyond GDP. And even beyond HDI, because the UN did bring in the HDI, so that's been useful. Some people are pointing to Bhutan and saying, well, look at its happiness index and see whether it's applicable for a country like India or not, or for specific regions of India. And we have actually started doing some work for Ladakh, where there is a little bit of interest in seeing, okay, what could be a well-being index for Ladakh? You might know that Sikkim actually has a bill, it's called the Well-Being of Future Generations Bill, that it's unfortunately not been introduced yet into the legislature, but it's there now. So therefore, at least in parts of our society, there is this rethinking saying, okay, what would be truly meaningful indicators of people being satisfied, being happy, being well, right? I don't even use development because that has its own connotations. But a well-being index, therefore, would say, does everybody have clean drinking water? Does everybody have adequate nutritious food? Does everybody have good opportunities for learning? Does everybody have good health and opportunities for treatment if something goes wrong? Do people have access to good communication? So so you can actually build up a whole series of indicators of that kind, which go beyond not just GDP, but even beyond the HDI. And to some extent, maybe the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, but actually to us, even beyond that, because we're also then talking about, does everybody have a voice in decision making? So many different aspects of that. And that's what we're trying to build up right now for Ladakh. So if we can think more along those lines, and if we can actually put pressure on the government saying, look, you need to think about this multifaceted set of indicators, if one is really serious about taking India to a position of where everybody is well. I'm just using the word well, and you can think of that in many different ways. Not where everybody is developed, because that has its own problematic connotations. Yeah. So, but everybody is well as a right, but everybody is well through processes in which they are also responsible for everybody else's wellness. That sense of collective well-being is, I think, very, very important, and we have to build the indexes for that.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And that will probably require listening to people, which we don't find many platforms or many opportunities. I mean, that will strongly require that everybody, people who don't have opportunities, people who are not participating in activity, should also be listened. I personally gained a lot of things during this conversation. I really like the conversation. And the concept of EcoSwaraj, Unswaraj, I mean, these are something which at least, I mean, we can try to follow, or at least we can also try to propagate in the area of our work, or with the government as well, or with other organizations. That was really, really, really helpful, Ashish. The entire conversation, I personally liked it very much. Probably I'll connect with you again offline. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for coming to this event. And I think everybody who joined this event must have liked the entire session. Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much.
Sabha. Thanks to UNDP and everybody else for this opportunity.
Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll connect again. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for
Thanks.
an
Thanks,
excellent
yeah.
discussion, and special thanks to Sabha for a very deft moderation. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. With this, we'll close the session and close the summit also. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.